This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of Isle of Elsi, Late Bloomer, and Carriers. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we're two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
And on the May webcomics episode, Sean and I are going to be discussing three different titles. We're going to begin with Alec Longstreth's Isle of Elsi. After that, we're going to look at Zealforart's Late Bloomer. And then we're going to wrap up with our already completed webcomic, Carriers, by Lauren Weinstein. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some wonderful specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
And we'd be remiss if we don't also point out their sister website, mydigitalcomics.com, where they sell a lot of your favorite titles in a digital format. We are talking about webcomics here, so it makes sense that if you'd be interested in the digital side of things, the electronic side of things, that's the place to check it out. They've got a lot of great publishers, too, like Image and Action Labs and Alterna, who's been making a few headlines now and then lately. With a bunch of their titles, most of their titles in CBZ or PDF formats that are DRM free, which are is definitely the way to go on that. Plus, you've got the added bonus of any purchases that you make on mydigitalcomics.com earn you 5% toward your purchases at Digital Comic Book Services. So you get a nice double bonus there.
That's right. You can't go wrong with the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service and their sister company, My Digital Comics. That's dcbservice.com or mydigitalcomics.com. You got to go there for all of your comics ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. Well, Sean, before we jump into this month's webcomic titles, let's talk a little bit about some of the big news from this past week, especially as it relates to webcomics. The 2017 nominees for the Eisner Awards were announced on Tuesday morning.
Yep.
And in a future episode of the Comics Alternative, I'm sure we'll talk about the various categories in more detail. But, you and I are particularly drawn to this year's nominations because of what they've done with webcomics, right?
Yeah. One of the problems I've had with both the Eisners and the Ignats and some of the other awards is that historically, they've conflated the webcomic and digital comics into one category. And this year, the Eisners have broken those out into two distinct and separate categories. This is the first time I've seen that done with a major comics award of any sort. That is a really great thing to see that they're actually seeing a little bit of distinction there. But, that being said, there's a few kind of question marks, that are kind of up in the air on this one here. Not sure that the categories, even though we have distinct categories, I'm not sure that they're really as well defined as they think they are.
Exactly. And in fact, when the nominees went up earlier this week, Sean and I were emailing back and forth quite a number of times over the past several days about this matter. And, our feelings were more or less this, right? There's the good thing, which is the Eisners have finally separated webcomics from digital comics as a category, and that's good.
Yeah.
The downside of that is that in reality, they really haven't made the distinction, because there are what we would at least consider webcomics in the digital comic category and digital comics, by our definition, in the webcomics category, and they've just messed it up quite a bit. And so when I guess my happiness when I first saw this distinction, webcomics and digital comics, was quickly squelched once I saw what they had been nominating in both of those categories.
Yeah. And like you said, we can get into this into a lot more detail, and we'll do that next month in our June episode. But I think as it is a new kind of, a new change here, both from the fact that this is the first time, and I think about a decade, they've been having at least a kind of digital / webcomics category of some sort. So first time they've made the distinction. So I think it's worth noting that they have at least started going down that path. But we've got enough issues that, we can devote a whole episode to tackling this stuff. And I think we'll probably end up doing that next month.
Yeah. As you mentioned, we're going to be devoting our June webcomics episode to a discussion of the actual webcomics in both of those categories. Now, in each category, webcomic and digital comic, there are 5. And by our definition, there are a total of 10, right? Between these two categories. But really, there are only 5 among these 10 that we would consider, I think, both unequivocally consider webcomics, no questions whatsoever. And those are going to be the ones that we'll be discussing next month, with the exception of Anne Sabla's Bird Boy, because we've discussed that on a previous webcomics episode. So that means next month we'll be discussing what we consider the 4 actual webcomics between these two categories, best webcomic and best digital comics. And then Sean and I will also go into more detail next month in that episode about what our issues are with their distinctions and their definitions of, let's say, a webcomic and a digital comic. Yeah.
And it's, to be fair, I mean, that's a discussion that has been ongoing, and there are some gray areas that still need to be kind of worked through, and probably in some cases you could legitimately put something that is a webcomic into a digital comics category and vice versa. I don't know that that's really the case here, though. So
right, exactly.
I think we've got some more cut and dried issues that could be addressed in this particular case.
Right. And there's even one webcomic in the best digital comic category that if you go to their website, it says a webcomic. So, yeah, Sean and I are getting into more detail and also become a little more, let's say, critical, but critical in a good way, next month when we devote the webcomic episode to the Eisner nominations.
Looking forward to it. That'll be a good discussion, I think.
Yes, it will be. So we'll have a lot of good things to say, some critical things to say. But before we leave the Eisners, I want to be critical with one other thing. This is another year that the comics alternative has been dissed. I had nominated, as I have for the past few years, the comics alternative for the best comics related periodical / journalism category. And they still do not consider podcasts as periodical / journalism, which is a shame.
Yeah, on the plus side, I mean, at least it's not us specifically. I mean, they're kind of dismissing the entire genre, as it were, the
medium,
venue, as opposed to just, those comic alternative guys, I don't care about them. Now let's look at these other podcast people. Those people are doing something good. So it's at least not directed at us specifically, I think, at least at this point.
Right. That's true. But if you look at some of these blogs that are nominated in terms of not only the amount, but the quality of content that they provide compared to what we do, there's just no game. I'm sorry, I'm biased, but
same here. I'm with you on that one.
Well, let's talk about something much more positive, and that is the webcomic titles that we're going to be discussing for May. And we're going to start with Alec Longstreth's Isle of Elsi. And you can find this at www.isleofelsi.com, and that is ISLEOFELSI. So the Elsi, that is the island, is, if you haven't figured it out, the inverse of the word isle. And there's a lot of language play in this webcomic that it's just like that.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting setup for a comic, I think, in that, comics are inherently a very visual medium, right? And it's a lot of focus goes towards the art itself. But what Longstreth is focusing on here actually tends to be more on the language and the wordplay, which is, I think, makes for an interesting little kind of flip of what you would think a comic would normally do.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this is a webcomic in the way that it's described on the About page. And I want to talk about the About page at some point, because I think this has to be the best About page I've seen of any webcomic I've ever read. And it is an all-age webcomic fantasy. And it's a fantasy in the strictest sense, in that there are dragons and there are wizards. But at the same time, it takes place in a world that, to a large degree, reflects the kind of reality that you and I inhabit. And this, I think, is not specific just to this webcomic of Longstreth's, but I think you can find this in other works of his as well. This kind of melding of what initially you would think of as kind of realism in comics, but with a fantastical bent. Now, let me ask you, Sean, are you familiar with the work of Alec Longstreth?
I've read a few pieces of his, yeah, and I'm drawing a blank. I forgot to pull out the actual titles in advance of the show, but I have read some of his work before. And in fact, I did. You were the one who suggested we do Isle of Elsi this month, and I had actually started reading it when he launched it as well. And for whatever reason, it kind of fell out of my regular routine. So I was at least vaguely familiar with it in advance. And from everything I've read, he's certainly a very, very talented creator. I've liked everything that he's done so far, or at least everything that I've read of his so far, and including Isle of Elsi here. So I think he's definitely a talent that probably goes unrecognized or underappreciated a lot more than he should.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Now, I first started reading Alec Longstreth through his mini comic Phase 7. And in fact, that's primarily what he's known for.
Sure.
And in fact, I subscribe to Phase 7. So it comes about, maybe 2-3 times a year, I guess. Maybe, is it 4 times? It doesn't seem that often. Yeah. And there is one longer narrative that he culled from his work in Phase 7, and that is Basewood. And we actually had Longstreth on the Comics Alternative back in August of 2014, soon after Basewood came out. And I think it was Andy Wolverton and I who interviewed him. And that was a really fun conversation. But, you can still find his book, Basewood, that's published by his Phase 7. I mean, Phase 7 is the title of his mini comic, but it's also, I guess, the name of his publishing arm, his self-publishing arm. So Basewood is published by Phase 7. And so that's how I know him. But now this is a relatively new project of his, and we learned this on the About page. And I guess he started this in 2016, because on the About page, and okay, let's get to a description of this About page, because the About page is a comic.
Yeah, he's basically set it up as himself explaining what he's doing, and in the process of doing that, he's actually interacting with some of the characters, and goes back and forth with them, talking about, here's what the comic is, here's what it's trying to do, and it's the characters themselves kind of get into this metatextual realm here, talking about they're kind of talking about themselves and their interactions in the comic in kind of the third person.
Right.
almost. So, but it's done in the same style and setup as the comic proper. So it flows very nicely. It's got the same, I mean, obviously it's still got his fingerprints all over it, but it flows very smoothly from this, what is it, like 3 or 4 pages here?
Yeah, 4 pages. Yeah.
It flows very smoothly, I think, from this, if you're reading this about page comic into the comic itself. There's a very smooth, easy transition because it's set up so similarly.
Right. And the way that he describes Isle of Elsi in this about page webcomic is that it is a free all ages fantasy webcomic. And that basically kind of encapsulates everything. And that description, free all ages fantasy webcomic, is really what this 4-page about piece explains. And, you mentioned that 2 of the characters come into the frame on the first page. Rex, or RJ, and Sally. So these are 2 characters that we'll discuss in a moment. And so these characters talk with their creator about this new webcomic. And so they ask him about this whole, one of my favorite parts is asking him, what is this all-age comics thing? Because Sally even does the air quotes. Hey, Alec, what did you mean when you said Isle of Elsi is an all-age comic? And his response is, well, that's a term adults use to make themselves feel better about reading kids' comics. And then there's a little question mark coming from Rex's head. And then Sally responds, oh, brother, is that like when they call comic books graphic novels? And then the cartoon Alec says, yeah, a bit. And then he talks about why he wanted to do something online, a webcomic for free. And he raises, I think, it's a serious point that tends to get overlooked in comics nowadays, because Alec tells his 2 characters, Rex and Sally, that when he was a kid, he used to go to the local drugstore and get individual issues of comics for 75 cents each. And I found it interesting that Sally responds by saying 75 cents. Boy, you must really be old. Which makes me feel old, because when I would go to my local drugstore and get comics, it would be, I remember them being 20 cents and then 25 cents.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, we're older than Alec. But his point is that these days comics are really expensive, and especially for younger readers, it's quite prohibitive. And also, if they can't drive, how are they going to get to a comic shop, right? It's not like they can go down to their local drugstore, their 7-Eleven, their Little General, their grocery store, and go to the spinner rack to get something. They have to have a means to get to the comic shop. And so he wanted to try this as a webcomic, and he describes this, Alec, the cartoon character, Alec Longstreth, describes this as his second major comics project, the first being Phase 7. And so this is something that we have no idea now how long this is going to go for, but in the About page comic, he's saying that this is a big project of his. So I guess we're going to have this for the long haul.
Yeah, it certainly looks like it. The way it's going so far, I certainly hope so. I mean, it's like I said, I've liked what he's done in the past, and so far we're 70 some pages into the
71 pages. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's been very enjoyable so far.
Yep. And it is, according to the website, updated every Thursday. And I want to talk about the story a bit, but I also want to talk later about the layout and the way that this website is designed, which I'm amazed at. But let's talk about the comic proper. This is a fantasy. It's the story of the main character, whose name is Rex, or he goes by the name, his name is Rex Jargon Jr., and his father was named Rex Jargon, so that's why he's a junior. But since Rex loves wordplay, he prefers people call him RJ, Rex Jargon Jr., so his name is a palindrome, RJ Jr.
Right.
And in the opening pages, we see him in school. And even though he is very intelligent, he doesn't pay attention to his studies as much as he should because he's so enamored of language and wordplay and punning. And in fact, I don't know about you, but I like decent punning as much as anyone, but I can see why RJ's friends and family get tired of him punning, because I was getting a little tired of that. But you're supposed to, right? I mean, that's the point of RJ doing everything that he does. He was getting on his fellow students' nerves, on the teachers' nerves. He finds out that when he goes home one day after school, his mother tells him that the man who owns the lumber mill also owns her house, and she pays rent to him, but he has to up either the rent or the mortgage. I can't remember which. And so they're going to need more money. So then RJ decides to drop out of school, and he'll study on his own, and he'll take a job and make money to help his mother so they don't have to worry about where they're going to live. And just as he did in school, he has problems, at least with the first 1 or 2 or 3 attempts at getting a job and keeping a job, because he loves to play around with words and he's very talkative. And so he ends up pissing off his coworkers and the boss. He ends up working, appropriately enough, at a bookstore, and the woman who oversees, and what is her name? I can't remember. But many people's names in this story are inverse of who they are, or the kind of job that they have. But the owner of the bookstore is going deaf, and so he can talk and pun and joke around as much as he wants, and his boss, the owner of the bookstore, won't be able to hear him.
Right.
Yeah. But about this time that he settles into the bookstore, a dragon by the name of Nogard, and Nogard, as you might expect, is dragon spelled backwards, comes into town and starts to destroy things, but then it begins to rain. It puts out the fires that he sets, and then everybody in the town is affright. Oh, the dragon's back. And then RJ asks, what do you mean the dragon's back? Because it's been 10 years since the dragon originally appeared, and RJ was just a baby when that happened, so he didn't remember. And then they tell him about the story of the dragon, and this is where I guess the heavy exposition comes into this webcomic. Rex learns that his father, the reason he's not around anymore is because he devoted himself to actually doing something about this dragon, and he went into the forest to take care of the dragon, and no one has seen him since. So it's been over 10 years now. And now the dragon has come back. They don't know why. Rex has taken it upon himself to be the one to follow in his father's footsteps to solve the problem of the dragon and attacking the town. And that's where we are. And once he's in the forest, things start to happen to him. He meets various people, and that's where we are in the adventure right now as of page 71.
Yeah, and what's interesting is we've just gotten to the point where he meets the dragon, and the dragon he quickly notices is speaking alliteratively. So every word of a sentence starts with the same letter, or nearly every word. Mm-hmm. And so that gives an interesting challenge for Rex to start playing that back. Right. And I think I don't know where this is going, right? What direction this will take, but it's like the first chance he's really had to challenge himself against another character who has the same kind of penchant for wordplay and verbal rapier wit kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And it'll be interesting to see where he goes with that. I think there's a lot of direction we could take that. But that's the first chance he's really had to meet someone in any way like himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And he is, throughout at least the first part of this webcomic, I wouldn't call him a loner, but he is an outsider. I mean, obviously he is accepted by his mother. That goes without saying. But other people in their community, and by the way, he lives in a village by the name of Ekaliv. which is village spelled backwards. Surprise, surprise. And outside of his mother and maybe his friend Sally, and her last name is Sanders, and so you have the alliteration with her name. He is seen as maybe more of a curiosity, a mild annoyance by most of the people in the town. So you're right. When he does meet Nogard the dragon, that he does meet a kindred spirit, although it's ironic that this kindred spirit of language is the creature that is supposedly dedicated to destroying his village.
Yeah, and I think that's where where there'll be an interesting challenge with the story and what direction Longstreth wants to take this, because because you've got these two characters who are essentially diametrically opposed to one another, but at the same time sharing that common bond, and I suspect we'll see some elocutions from the dragon about how he's also a fairly lonely and isolated character as well. He's out in the woods by himself at this point. He's physically isolated from everybody else. So it'll be interesting to see if there's a companionship that comes up out of that, that in turn helps prevent the dragon from destroying the town, or is there more of a challenge going back and forth between them as they get into stronger and more challenging, more difficult word games?
Right. A couple things about his journey into the woods that I found interesting is, we've mentioned the wizard whose name is Dreziw, Draziw, of course, wizard spelled backwards. And so here we have, not only a fantasy, but also we have a narrative that's in the mold of, let's say, Joseph Campbell's, Hero with a Thousand Faces, right? So RJ goes on a quest. He meets the wise man here with the wizard. And so I'm wondering, as RJ gets deeper and deeper into this quest, if we will see more Campbell-esque elements come through here. But another thing that I found interesting about RJ's journey into the forest, and especially in meeting the wizard lives in a treehouse, which is yes, as they do. But it's interesting in that tree houses are very important in Longstreth's basewood. And so I think that Longstreth has a thing for tree houses, which is cool. If I had a tree house that is as elaborate as the ones that Alec Longstreth illustrates in both Basewood and Isle of Elsi, I'd live in one.
I tried suggesting that to my wife when we were house hunting a few years ago, and she said, that's fine. It looks cute and all, but one day where you're coming home from, hanging out with your friends and you've had one too many drinks, that's just one step away from a broken neck. So there is a little bit of danger involved with that. That's from a practical perspective, is all I'm saying. Yep. But for a fantasy story like this, I think it works well. That's clever.
Now, if you were to describe to someone who's unfamiliar with Alec Longstreth's art, how would you do so?
My initial go-to word would be simple, but I think that's not really accurate. It's certainly very cartoony. It looks like it's got a very kind of child-friendly approach to it. It looks like something you might find in a kid's book or on a Saturday morning cartoon, that type of thing. However, there's enough going on and enough detail there that I think he's doing. I think it's a little bit more elaborate than what you would typically get in just kind of like at least the stereotypical version of a kid's book or a cartoon or whatever. In particular, we were just talking about the integration of and talking with the wizard. There's this whole sequence where the wizard is putting together a sleeping potion, and as he's pulling the ingredients out, he's making kind of he's talking about, okay, well, I'll add the yawn of a yak and a dream full of drama and some Z's from a zebra and 2 snores from a snake and all that kind of thing. But as he's doing that, then there's the visuals that go along with that are actually pretty clever, right? He's talking about putting in a yawn of a yak, and he empties this canister into a pot, and it's just the word yawn, right? Which I think is kind of a clever little approach to things. When he's talking about adding a dream full of drama, it's actually a thought balloon cloud that's falling out with it looks like a knight in shining armor. And I think there's a lot of little clever things like that he's throwing in that aren't really integral to the story itself, but show that he's putting a lot of thought into what is, at least superficially, a fairly simple and direct illustration.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you've said. If I were going to describe his style, I'm with you in that, simple on the one hand might make sense, but that comes with its own baggage. That word comes with some baggage.
Sure.
I would call it more clear line and iconic in that you don't have that much detail. So, for instance, with these characters, you don't have really much shading. You don't have cross-hatching. You don't have those kind of textures. Any, I guess, detail, visually speaking, is going to come through patterns primarily. And so it is... it does come across as a little cartoony, but cartoony in a positive way, right? A lot of people use the word cartoony negatively.
Sure.
Manner. And what you said makes a lot of sense. It does have an all-age friendly feel to it. And, when you read his other comics, I think it's the same thing. So if you go back and look at not only Basewood, but let's say issues of his mini-comic Phase 7, it looks the same, although it's in black and white. And you would think by looking at the visuals that this may be for younger readers, but it's not the case. I think that a younger reader could read Basewood and the parent would be okay with it. I don't think there's anything wrong with what he does in Basewood, and I think even the vast majority of Phase 7. But yeah, it is something that I think a lot of younger readers would be drawn to. I think it's quite effective. And I love with Longstreth's work the juxtaposition of this iconic, or if you want to call it simple, art and the sophistication of the storytelling, because that kind of disjointedness is what really impresses me, because you would think from the art, someone who has never seen Longstreth's work before, that this is going to be, for kids, kind of a simple, straightforward story, but it's not that case at all. And the characterization, the plot, all of it, I think, is quite sophisticated and complex, especially the deeper you get into his narratives. And, as you mentioned, we're 71 pages into Isle of Elsi now, and, we've had plenty of time for there to be a number of twists and turns.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something that did not occur to me reading it, but it clicked as soon as you mentioned, there's almost a clear line style to this, right? It's not quite there, I don't think, in that it doesn't have the formality, that I would typically associate that with, especially with somebody like a hair guy, with the, not only is the lines very kind of uniform, but they're also very rigid too, right? If there's a architectural building there, every line is perfectly straight, and you don't quite get that with Longstreth's work. There's a little bit of variability there. It looks like it's a straight line, but it was a hand drawn straight line kind of thing.
Right.
But I think it's close enough to that clear line style that I think that's a good way of kind of approximating verbally how to explain his work and stylistically. Because if you look at your hair gaze and artists who follow in that style, in that manner, they also tend to have fairly simplistic looking line drawings that belie a very complex and nuanced story in a lot of cases, right? And I think, that makes that kind of gets where Longstreth is going with this as well, I think.
Right. Another thing I wanted to mention about Isle of Elsi. Now, if you go to the very first page of this webcomic, we don't get a chapter number, but we do get a title of this, what I'm assuming is the first story, and that is RJ Jr. in The Dragon's Librarian. Okay. So that tells you that this first narrative that is making up this webcomic Isle of Elsi, this may be much more of a composite kind of webcomic than I initially thought it was. In other words, in the future, so this first story, RJ Jr. in The Dragon's Librarian, then after Longstreth finishes this story, maybe he'll go on to another story that will include Sally, because although we do see Sally in this, the first 71 pages a few times, it's not for any long period of time. It's not much detail. I mean, she plays an important role, but it's not the kind of role that you would consider for a protagonist. And if we go by what Longstreth writes about in the About page, that 4-page comic about what Isle of Elsi is, she's going to be one of the main cast members. And she's also listed as one of the 4 so far main cast members of Isle of Elsi. So I would guess that she, maybe later on, Draswell, the wizard, and maybe other characters will have their own stories, all housed under the umbrella of the webcomic Isle of Elsi.
And the other potential idea here too is that RJ here still remains the main protagonist throughout the series, but the other characters kind of come in and out and play more or less significant roles depending on the nature of the story. So that's a distinct possibility as well for taking things down the road.
Right.
And kind of like, again, going back to Hergé and a Tintin type of thing. Tintin is the primary character throughout his series, but, we'll have more of the Thompson brothers in this, or the Thompson twins in this series, versus the next one. Or, Snowy figures more prominently into this story than that one. We might get something more along those lines as well, too.
Right. But I think that with what we see on this very first page, right, the title RJ Jr. in The Dragon's Librarian, that however Longstreth chooses to do it, that Isle of Elsi is going to be a collection of individual stories, that each of which have their own titles.
Sure. Yeah, that would absolutely make sense. And I'm perfectly fine with that. Everything I've seen so far, I mean, we're talking about RJ. He's clearly the protagonist of this first story. But it's not like the other characters are just there for a little bit of exposition or something, right? There's a whole sequence there with the wizard, something about he's got this extra room that's not a guest room, and he's making sure that RJ doesn't see it. There's a whole backstory we don't know about there, right? So that could be an entire story in and of itself.
Exactly, yeah.
There's certainly more to that character than just, hey, here's a sleeping potion to help you with the dragon, right? There's a story there. And I suspect we have that with a lot of the other characters. There's the 2 bully characters, whose names I'm drawing a blank on the top of my head, from his school. I think we start to see a little bit of where their home life is with that. And I think
is
there's
it
a
Mulligan?
Lot more.
Mulligan's one of the guys.
Yeah, I think so.
Both of their names start with an M.
Yeah. And I think, there's a lot you can go with in that direction too, right? They're not just these 2-dimensional bullies. Even in this short sequence that we've seen, they're not just these 2-dimensional bullies that are there just to torment RJ while he's in school, right? They've got kind of a background there, and we don't know what that is, but there's certainly room for Longstreth to go down that direction. And whether that's as a story with those characters as the protagonists themselves, or if it remains RJ as protagonist and them kind of acting as kind of more prominent secondary characters.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And now you mentioned those 2 characters and how they're not just 2-dimensional bullies. I mean, that's what we learn when RJ goes into the forest when he begins his quest, and he comes upon not only those two bullies, but also their fathers, right? Mm-hmm. And their fathers obviously are not a very good influence on who they are. And yeah, I'm at those pages now. We first see this scene, on page 50, and Mulligan is one of the kids' names. So I got that. And Mulch is the other one. And so their fathers are even crueler than their sons are. And when their fathers are wanting to get rid of RJ, you can see that the sons, Mulligan and Mulch, are uncomfortable with that. And so it does demonstrate that there's some depth to their character. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy and appreciate what Longstreth is doing here. If, as he said in the About page, and we referenced this earlier, when he says he's about, in 2006 to launch his second big comics project, Isle of Elsi. If this is going to be a project on the scale of, let's say, Phase 7, then, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a lot of webcomic here. And so I'm excited to find out about this, because it's almost as if, I mean, I didn't see it like you from the very beginning. I learned about it probably about 2-3 months ago. But it's almost as if I'm getting in close to the ground floor.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, this will be a big project for him. This will be going on for a while. So I think even if people jumping in now on page 71, I think that's still would be considered more or less ground floor. I think we're looking at, several hundred pages here easily.
Oh yeah.
And probably over several volumes.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to come back to something that I alluded to earlier, and that is the design of this website. On the Comics Alternative webcomic series, not only do we talk about story content, but we also talk about the design of the website, because that can make a big difference, right? I mean, can you find your way around? Can you easily get to an archive? Is there an about page with a cast list to it? Can you find out information about, how to share this on social media? Do they allow comments? All of that, I think, goes into the webcomics reading experience. And we've discussed a number of webcomics on this series over the past couple of years whose design I really love, but I have to say that of all the webcomics that we have looked at so far, this hands down is the best design. If for no other reason, because this is something that Longstreth himself did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's all built around the characters and the setup of the story itself, right? So since we're talking audibly here and we don't have visuals to show you, basically the comic itself rests through the middle of the web page, and on either side of that you see in slight perspective the ends of a couple of bookcases, right, filled with books, and just tons of stuff going on there. And then down the spine or down the side of the bookcases are all the links, right? Here's the archive, here's the cast page, here's the news page, here's the about page, here's the link to Facebook, here's Twitter, etc. And then as you click on those, in not every case, but in most of the cases, the bookshelves will actually start sliding off to the left or right, depending on which one it is, and display the content of that page or of that link on the bookshelf as the bookshelf is extended through the entire page of the entire web page that you're seeing there. So right. You click on the cast page, and the entire right-hand bookshelf slides into the left, covers up whatever content was on that page, and then you can scroll down and see on the shelves are a picture of Rex and a picture of Sally, a picture of Nogard. You click on the archive page, and the left bookshelf slides out to the right, and you get the drop down of here's, pick page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. So it's all built around and all created by Longstreth's artwork, right? Mm-hmm. And typically, and we don't see that very often in at all in any capacity, right? And most people just say, okay, here's First, next, back arrows. Here's some text links across the top that say about, shop, archive, whatever. This one, he's clearly spent a lot of time developing that and trying to build that into the structure of how he's presenting this story.
Exactly. And, the vast majority of the webcomics that we look at are housed on, let's say, places like, WordPress, or let's say Blogger or even Tumblr. And in all of those cases, what the creators are doing, and again, nothing wrong with this, but they're using designs, they're using themes that are developed by other individuals. And, as we were talking to Jim and Paul over the past several months about the ins and outs of starting a webcomic, it takes all you can to get the content out there, and you just don't have the time for the browser or the web design. But one of the things that's so impressive about Isle of Elsi is that Longstreth has taken the time to do his own web page design. So the layout, how you get from one point to another, this is all him. And it's just very impressive. It's very easy to find your way around. As you were describing, sometimes you have some, like you said, animation of the sliding bookshelf. I really enjoy that. This is something that I cannot recommend enough. It's a fun story. It's engaging. It's a great website. And I think that people definitely should check it out and consider supporting Longstreth. Everybody we discussed that has a Patreon account, we do think it's a good idea to support them on Patreon. But as Alec Longstreth makes clear in his About page, this is free. This is for kids. And instead of charging people for it, he's put up a Patreon account. And he says maybe someday this will come out in print. But for now, he's making this available. You can first see it as a webcomic. And so you can find a link on that site to his Patreon campaign. And it's still early in the game. He has 40 patrons. He's making $128 as of this weekend when we record this. So definitely check out Isle of Elsi, and I think you'll be impressed.
Yeah, it's definitely a really good comic and one that's really enjoyable. Even if you're not familiar with Longstreth's work from the past, this would be a great introduction to it. Mm-hmm.
Well, Sean, you want to move to the second webcomic that we're looking at for this month?
Sure, absolutely. We are talking about a comic called Late Bloomer, which is by Zealforart. I'm butchering your name.
Zealforart.
Zealforart. Oh, she totally did not even get that. This is why I usually ask for you to do the people's names, the creators' names when we're talking here. Okay. But yeah, Zealforart, and it's on webtoons.com, and you can, as we've discussed some of their work before, it's a kind of a collective, so you can go to webtoons.com and link to Late Bloomer from that.
Mm-hmm. Right. And actually, Zealforart is an artist by the name of Tiffany Woodall. And I know that because I was looking up, who is Zealforart? And she has a website, which is, appropriately enough, zealforart.com. Now, Late Bloomer is not housed there, but she has a link to Late Bloomer on Webtoons. But Tiffany Woodall goes by the name of Zealforart. And I think the best way of describing what Late Bloomer is all about is from the description on the very front page of Late Bloomer on Webtoons. Meet Mai, a woman born with a flower bud growing from her belly. The rare condition, botanical development, has followed her from childhood into adulthood. In order to rid the bud, it has to bloom and be deflowered. But the bud will only bloom once Mai has found a mate. Unfortunately, Mai is awkward and inexperienced when it comes to the dating world. Join this eccentric 26-year-old on her journey to becoming deflowered in Late Bloomer. Now, in essence, that is the description that I saw several weeks ago when I got an email alerting me to this, new comic on Webtoons, Late Bloomer. And I thought, okay, that sounds interesting. I like the idea of this flower growing out of this young woman's belly, and she needs to be deflowered, so to speak, in order to be deflowered, literally. And so that's one of the reasons why I recommended that we check this out. I think I'd looked through that first installment at the time and thought, okay, this could be interesting. This is described as a romance, and since we're talking about being deflowered in a relationship and finding a mate, it's what you would expect, right? And so this is a romance webcomic. So far, we have, as of yesterday, in fact, May 5th, 7 installments. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Webtoon, or maybe even listen to our previous episode several months ago where we looked at one of the webcomics on Webtoon, that each webcomic is in chapters or episodes, and the episodes are arranged in a vertical manner. So in order to read a particular episode, you have to scroll down. So in that way, it's very much like what Study Group does with its webcomics.
Yeah, probably the biggest distinction between the two of them, though, is that Webtoons, their primary platform is actually the phone, right? So the whole format, the setup. Obviously, we can. The web in general is kind of conducive to that infinite scroll possibility. But the Webtoons specifically are catered towards reading on the phone, right? So the graphics tend to be a little bit on the even more narrow and vertical side. So in some of the other cases, we might see 2 or 3 panels across horizontally, but you still have to scroll down. In Webtoons, it's primarily 1 at a time, maybe 2, because you're looking at it on such a small device, or it's intended to be looked at on such a small device. Now, you certainly can read it on a laptop or on a tablet or anything like that. There's certainly no problems with that. But they are designed, I think, a little bit more for the phone market. So hence there's a lot more scrolling, and there's very little in terms of the horizontal development of the story.
Yeah, almost nothing horizontal. You're right. Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. Now, I don't want to discuss this now because this is something that we will surely address in much more detail in next month's episode, where we look at the Eisner nominees for webcomics and digital comics. But I want to make a passing distinction between what Webtoons is doing as, let's say, a smartphone device and what another platform does, and that is Stila. And we'll talk about Stila much more next month because of the Eisners. But the difference between the two is that any webcomic that is on the Webtoons platform, you could read in its entirety through a web browser, right? So I have no problem whatsoever calling what we find on Webtoons a webcomic. And they are in the fullest sense of the word. Stila, though, it's a different matter because you can read a little bit of a webcomic on Stila, maybe the first episode and a little bit of other ones. But after that first full episode, Stila, and understandably so, I know why they do it. It's a business model. They truncate the narrative, and you have to download the app, and then you even have to purchase from my experiences, the comics in order to read further. Now, it's not the purchasing of the comic that problematizes the Stila comics as webcomics. It's that you have to go, in essence, offline, off the internet, off the web, in order to fully read the stories on Stila. That I have a problem with within the context of defining webcomics. Again, we'll, I think, revisit this in much more detail next month, but I'm glad that you mentioned that Webtoons is, I guess, primarily designed as a platform for the smart device, but at the same time, you can read full stories, full comics through a web browser.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's And I think we talked about this on the last time we had a Webtoons comic, but just to remind people who forgotten or didn't hear that episode, they're actually a company out of Korea. And because that's kind of where that smartphone focus comes from, right? Because there's such a large contingent of the population who rely on smartphones much more heavily than the United States at a per capita level. And there's just a very strong focus for comics and developing comics online through your phone, specifically out of Korea. So what they've basically done is they've been very successful over there, and essentially established kind of an American division of the same company using more or less the same platform, the same functionality. And that's where we get comics like Late Bloomer here. They're developed specifically for this phone platform because that's something from a technological point of view that they've kind of already set up and established. Webtoons has as part of their business platform. So it's easy for them to kind of pick up, okay, here's this cool artist doing this cool thing. We just tell them to use this format and we can throw it into our Webtoons platform really easily.
Right.
So and that I think starts to talk also to the content of and the stylistic content of something like Late Bloomers too, right? There's very heavy, manga and manhwa influence. Right. In this comic. And it's not just the superficial of, okay, they draw really big eyes and the, cute characters or whatever, the kind of stereotypical anime manga drawings. But I think there's a lot of nods in the storytelling itself, right? In terms of how she's progressing the story along, how the characters are interacting. It's not just picking up those kind of superficial elements of, oh, okay, we'll do a little droplet over somebody's eyebrow for showing that they're kind of surprised or whatever, or the little starburst thing to show kind of like a pseudo popping vein kind of look for when they're angry, or that kind of thing. There certainly are those stylistic elements to this. And there's even a reference somewhere in there. She's picking up manga from a drugstore, right? And there's references to some current series. One Punch Man. In fact,
this is called this title is called like One Slap Man.
Right. There's One Punch Man. There's a reference to Assassination Classroom. There's an Attack on Titan, I think, is referenced. So it's clearly there's got that kind of superficial stuff that shows, okay, this is where this is coming from. But again, the overall storytelling, kind of the slowing down and the emphasis on the interactions of people and the emotions of the characters, is much stronger than you would typically see in a more Western, stereotypically Western comic, even an online one.
Right, exactly. And in fact, I mean, this comic, or this title, Late Bloomer, definitely has a very strong shoujo feeling, and not just in terms of the art. Now, you mentioned the larger eyes. There are occasions where that's the case, but also in terms of reactions from various characters, like when they're angry or when they're surprised, the way that Zealforart draws her figures, very much like you would find, let's say, expressions and actions in manga. So it's not just the art, but it's also, I think, the expressions, but content as well, because we're dealing with, as I mentioned, this is a romance, and you're dealing with relationships, and to some degree, and you tell me if you got the same feel as I did, that this story seems to be a little decompressed. Yeah. And by that I mean, not that it's necessarily slow, but it's just taking us a while to get really anywhere. Now, episode 7 went up just yesterday, and there's not much that has happened. In fact, the biggest action that's taken place in Late Bloomer so far is that our protagonist, Mai, has been set up with I guess a profile on a dating site. Her friends Flora and Wendy helped her set it up. They took pictures, and so in other words, she's trying to meet someone that she could get involved with, and as I mentioned earlier, become deflowered in more ways than one. And she ends up going on a date with a guy named Mr. Ambition 100. At least that's his screen name, and that's basically the biggest thing that's happened so far.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going with the manga influence, right? I mean, that's not uncommon in manga stories, that you have these huge extended volumes where, you know, from an action point of view, not much takes place. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, that's certainly a different type of story, one that I think a lot of Western audiences are not used to. There's certainly a lot in Western audiences that are, right. There's a very healthy manga section in the local Barnes and Noble, and that there's a good reason for that. But for the people who are reading, I think what are more typically thought of as Western webcomics, you know, like even something like Isle of Elsi that we were talking about earlier, expect a little bit more movement of the story itself, and not so much focusing on the dramatic interactions of the characters and the emotional roller coaster that people are going through, even in small moment-to-moment sequences. Right.
I think another part of this webcomic, Late Bloomer, that has kind of a shōjo feel to it, right, for younger female readers, especially younger readers, is something that kind of stands out in this story, and that is Mai's pet duck, Ping. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say it stands out, I mean, it's not unusual for a human to have a pet, and that pet becomes a character. I mean, Peanuts, right? You know, Snoopy interacts with Charlie Brown and the rest of the Peanuts crew in ways that are human-like. And that's the relationship that we see between Mai and her pet duck, Ping. But the thing that stands out is we see Ping, and he's fairly active in the first 2 episodes. But after that, he recedes into the background. I don't remember anything about Ping of any substance after episode 2.
Nothing of substance. He basically, from what I've seen and what I recall here, he hangs out while she's getting ready. You know, she's looking in the bathroom mirror, you know, and he's just kind of sitting there watching her or listening to her as she's talking about what she's doing. After the date goes horribly wrong and she goes back to, eat, what was it? I forget, burritos or something and watch TV. He ends up hanging out on the couch with her, but, and acts as kind of a comfort character, but not in any substantial way. Like you said, she's not actively talking to her. She's not even really petting him or cuddling him or anything. It's just, he's hanging out with her.
Right. This is, I think, the kind of a webcomic we were talking about, Isle of Elsi, that is intentionally an all-age webcomic. This is one that, even though it may not be described as something for younger readers, I do think it will appeal primarily to, let's say, teenage readers primarily.
I could see that, yeah.
And the story we have, as we've mentioned, not much has happened so far. So basically, we have she works at a travel agency that goes by the name of Galavoyage, and she is one of the travel agents along with her friend Flora. Mai doesn't seem to be very good with people. You know, therein lies part of the irony that she is a travel agent. And this travel agency, as we get into this webcomic, especially by the most recent episode, we learn that they're not doing the kind of business that they need to do, that, you know, their boss, whose name is April, but it's spelled Eprille. May have to let someone go. From what I can see, April seems to be, an attractive young man. And when I first saw him interacting with Mai, I thought, okay, we're going to get a relationship between these two because there is this tension, and this is where the romance comes in, right? So, Mai is online trying to find a date, but, as fate would have it, her Prince Charming is right there at her door. In other words, her boss, and she didn't know it. I mean, that's what I'm assuming is going to happen. But I'm wondering at what point will begin some kind of relationship between Mai and April.
Well, and I think that kind of goes back to the, again, circling back to the manga influence here. Because of that, I think that's going to be a while. Mm-hmm. I expect that she will end up, I mean, she's gone on the one date and it went horribly wrong. I suspect this will be something that's drawn out over time, and one of the elements being, we've seen April certainly has some there's some tension between him and her because of the job. The boss underling kind of relationship and that dynamic, right? His job is to make sure that sales go up. She's not doing a good job of it. There's tension there. Right. But I think he also shows that there's a sequence there where she's going back from this really horrible date. She looks terrible because her coat caught on fire and she's had a glass of water thrown in her face because her coat was on fire. She looks terrible. And he gets her a cab, right? And pays for it and says, here, take the cab home. It's all taken care of, right? And then doesn't expect, it doesn't mention it the next day at work and not like, hey, watch what you're doing as just out on the town or whatever. Right. So there is some compassion there. So he's not just a cruel, hard-edged boss, clearly from the start, but in terms of getting to the point where, and I agree with you, I think that's where the story would end up ultimately is the two of them getting together, but he's not far enough in a point yet where that discussion has really even started, right? Because we're only 7 episodes in, certainly very early, but my guess is that we're going to see her go through this series of probably some series of bad dates, as well as one or two that do reasonably well. And only when April starts seeing her in some kind of decent relationship or somewhat approximation of a decent relationship, that he starts saying, hey, you know what? She could do better. Right. And then started getting into a kind of a love triangle type of thing. It would be my expectation. That being said, just knowing how, manga series often work, shōjo in particular, I wouldn't expect to see that for a while. Right. And getting to the point where they actually establish a relationship of some sort.
Yeah. And that's basically where we are right now with Late Bloomer. As we mentioned, it's a fairly recent webcomic, only 7 episodes, but, we do have a solid setup. Yeah. Yeah. And interesting too, within the Webtoons, environment, I think is, I find it always interesting to kind of see when people kind of do these collectives and from a business point of view and see how those work. Cause not only have you got, Late Bloomer here, but it's very easy then to slide into some of the other comics that they have available, right? Mm-hmm. They do have hey, if you like this, you might also try this, or just if you're using the app, then here's where the latest episodes of whatever comics are, and here's what here's other things that are popular in this genre and that kind of thing. So I think this is interesting from a story perspective on its own, but also, like I said, within the context of Webtoons, interesting way to draw readers into webcomics writ large. Right. And by the way, we should mention that that earlier webcomic from Webtoons that we discussed on the episode was Dean Haspiel's The Red Hook. And we discussed Red Hook last year, I think last September. And now Red Hook, I just checked out. Last year it was wrapped up, so it's completed. It's 26 chapters long.
Okay, excellent, excellent.
Okay, let's move on to the final webcomic that we're going to be looking at this month, and this is our already completed webcomic. This is Lauren Weinstein's Carriers. Now, this webcomic originally appeared, and you can still find it there, on the website Nautilus, and probably the best way of getting to that is just to go to nautil.us. Nautilus. So nautil.us, and then do a search for Carriers. Or probably it's easier if you go to Lauren Weinstein's website and you can find it. That's www.laurenweinstein, that's one word, .com. And then you can find that from her webcomics link. Or projects link, and she has the entire Carriers webcomic there on her site as well. So either way, you can get the complete story. I mean, I personally prefer Weinstein's personal website because everything, all 5 parts of it, are on one page, whereas Nautilus, you have 5 different pages, each one for one of the parts.
Yeah, it does make for a slightly awkward reading experience because it's not a particularly long comic by any stretch.
No.
But I see why they did that, because I mean, it was my understanding is that it was essentially commissioned by Nautilus commissioned to Weinstein by Nautilus. And so they ended up serializing it over the period of a month or so. Mm-hmm. So it makes sense in that particular format, but again, I don't know that it's the ideal format. I think you see that a lot is, the way publishers often treat webcomics isn't necessarily the best way to treat webcomics. And I don't know that that's necessarily done out of malice, but probably more out of ignorance more than anything else.
Right. Now, this originally came out beginning in June 2014. It's in 5 parts. This was nominated for an Ignatz Award. Was it last year or 2015? I can't remember. Maybe I guess it would be 2015.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And it's basically, the story is autobiographical in nature, where Lauren and her husband are wanting to have a baby, but they find out that both of them are carriers of cystic fibrosis. And so there seems to be a higher than normal possibility that their child will have cystic fibrosis. And so, in essence, this webcomic is about what Lauren and her husband, but primarily Lauren, goes through in learning that both of them are characters and trying to struggle as a couple of whether or not to have this child.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I really like about that. We talked about a couple of different options for a completed comic to talk about this month. And one of the reasons I wanted that I said, let's do Carriers, is that it gets into a lot of, I think what I would like to personally see more of in webcomics is not just the autobiographical stuff, but the pieces that kind of get into the more, I guess, different perspectives on things, right? I think that, obviously a lot of people are out having children. A lot of women are pregnant. That's not terribly uncommon, but to face that challenge of having both the husband and the wife, or the father and the mother, both be a carrier for something like cystic fibrosis that would lead to, if a child was born with that, a very challenging and difficult life at best. it kind of gets into that kind of a realm that's, I think, opens up the idea of what other people are going through, and kind of, I don't know, you might call them like empathy type comics, right?
Yeah.
And I think that I would personally like to see a lot more of that kind of stuff, because it's not something that I've ever considered, right? My wife and I don't have children. We've never considered having children. So, this type of issue would never come up. And it's not something I would think about without having read a comic like this.
Yeah, that's an important point. I hadn't even thought about that when we were deciding on whether or not to discuss carriers for this month. But you're right. That is the kind of subject matter that I think is more of a rarity in webcomics, and especially for us on the webcomics episode, we tend not to choose those kind of webcomics. Only one other quote-unquote serious or helpful, or if you want to call this somewhat autobiographical, webcomic that we looked at that comes to mind is last year we looked at Stuart Campbell's These Memories Won't Last.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that had a very similar feel to it. Now, granted, These Memories Won't Last was partially an animated webcomic, so it's different in many ways. I mean, this is not by any means, but it does deal with a similar subject matter, right? It deals with health. In the case of These Memories Won't Last, the health of the mental health, cognitive health of father or was it father or grandfather?
It was grandfather, I believe.
Grandfather, right, because it was his experiences in the war.
Right.
And so here we're dealing with a somewhat similar issue in Carriers, dealing with a health problem and decisions that need to be made. And the kind of webcomics that you and I tend to discuss on this monthly show are fiction. Now, sometimes they're genre-based, sometimes they're not as much genre, a particular genre like fantasy or sci-fi, but they're more times than not works of fiction, right? People telling stories and fun stories, but it's not often that we look at a webcomic that deals with such a heavy topic. Yeah.
And like I said, I think it's one of the things that I try to do a lot, just in my comic reading in general, right? The stuff that when I go to a show, going up and down Artist Alley, there's a lot of people who are, okay, my comic is, what if Batman and Captain America were in the X-Files, or, some kind of weird little, weird kind of mashup like that, which is clearly, maybe not derivative per se, but nominally not all that different than what you can get from Marvel or DC or, any kind of science fiction genre piece or whatever. And that's fine. I enjoy those too. But the ones that really stand out for me are the ones that do something, that do something different and speak to an experience that is just completely outside and different from myself. Right. Here's what if, there were these characters that had to deal with growing up in 1940s Alabama during, World War II, and there was a mixed race relationship there, or, something like that. That's right. That's a very unique kind of perspective that you don't think about, I think, in a lot of cases. And one of the ones that, me speaking as a cisgender heterosexual white male, that's just not on my radar if I don't choose it to be. So that's one of the things that I try to do personally, is to try to choose to put that on my radar a little bit more actively. And I seek out a lot more comics like this in general to say, hey, there's this other experience out there that I will never have, right? I'm never going to go through childbirth. just on the basis of gender, I'm never going to go through childbirth. Right. But thinking about, oh, wait, you know what? There are issues there that aren't often talked about, right? That your child could be born. You could know before your child is born that your child might have or has a strong chance of being born with some disease that will be very challenging, to say the least, at the least. And what is it? What does that emotional cycle go through? And what does that person go through? And it for me, then carries that into the rest of my life. So when I'm talking with, for example, the cashier at the grocery store, and she's giving me lip and she's got a bad day coming, maybe she's being an asshole, but maybe she's dealing with this. Mm-hmm. Right. And I try to make myself a better person by reading these types of comics and saying, that's an experience I will never have. That's an experience that somebody else might be dealing with anytime I'm talking to someone. I don't know what they're going through, but this might be it. Right.
Now, let me ask you, how familiar are you with the work of Lauren Weinstein?
Not very much at all, honestly.
Okay. Now, she does a strip for the Village Voice called Normal Person, and normal is spelled N-O-R-M-E-L, not A-L. Mm-hmm. And these have, I don't know if you want to call it slice of life. I don't necessarily like that term. More of a realistic, if you want to say autobiographical feel to it. Which is somewhat similar, I think, to what we have going on in Carriers. Right now, Carriers is obviously or clearly autobiographical. But I was first introduced to Lauren Weinstein by her earliest comics, which are very different in tone. Her first book, Inside Vineland, and I guess it's pronounced Vineland and not Vineland because it's Vineyland, L-A-N-D. And this came out in 2003. It was a Xeric Award winner. And it's a collection of, how do I put this? Really weird stories of various lengths. And she's got a great sense of humor, really strange and twisted imagination. That all comes through in Inside Vineland. And then 3 years after that, she published Girl Stories, which I guess is autobiographical in nature, but it deals with her growing up, like right around the time that she goes into high school, in the early years of high school. And some of the scenarios as they're described are really crazy and funny. And so it has a similar tone to what you find in the first book, Inside Vineland. But the tone of those early works, very, very different from what we see in not only her Normal Person strip in Village Voice, but definitely back to the matter at hand, Carriers. This is serious subject matter that we have going on here. And because it's her and her husband having to decide, do we want to have this child? Because there seems to be, according to the webcomic, a 25% chance that the child, being the child of two carriers of cystic fibrosis, will have it. And if that's the case, it will not, the child could still live a long life, but it won't be easy and it won't be without pain and discomfort. And that's what they have to grapple with.
Yeah. And that's essentially that. That's ultimately, that's the entire story, right? Is mm-hmm. it literally opens with, her and her husband finding out, it's like right after the ultrasound, and ends with the child being born. Spoiler alert, they do go have the child, is born ultimately. But yeah, so everything in between is basically her just kind of going back and forth and wrestling with this question, which mm-hmm. sounds, not very entertaining, not very, deep. Deep is probably the wrong word. Not very, active, I guess. Mm-hmm. But there's enough back and forth. There's enough ping ponging going around. There's enough details about what she's looking up, and what she's trying to react to, that I think makes it a very interesting, story. You're basically following her emotional journey from, oh wow, we're pregnant. That's awesome. We get to have a kid, to, oh my God, do we want to have this kid? Right. And everything that goes into that. It sounds like a fairly simple, straightforward, journey when I say it like that, but it really isn't. And I think there's a lot of depth here in that sense.
Yeah. Now, you were talking earlier when we were discussing Late Bloomer about the Webtoons platform, being primarily intended for the smartphone and having a vertical feel, right? So as you read the comic, you would scroll down. Now, you don't have carriers developed for the same platform, but the way that Weinstein does structure her story, the way that you read it, is not that dissimilar to Late Bloomer and the other comics you see on Webtoons, is that this was meant to be read by scrolling down. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that this is in 5 parts, and on the original Nautilus page, each of those 5 parts are on separate pages. And again, a little awkward to go from one to the other. But on each of those pages, you basically scroll down in order to get the next panel or the next page, depending on how you want to describe that. And the way that she structures the story, especially in terms of the art, literally requires you to scroll down vertically in order to read it. So there are, let's say, for example, cases of word balloons, right, that are linked in a vertical fashion. So you would go to something that one person said, and then the next thing they say is below that, but it's linked vertically underneath, so you have to scroll down in order to read that, and the next thing they say, so on and so forth. Also, throughout the various 5 parts of Carriers, there are parts of the story or the exposition, right? I mean, there's one case early on where Weinstein is actually describing for us what the situation is with both her and her husband being carriers of cystic fibrosis and what that means for not only just them, but also what it means to their family, the ones who came before them and the ones who could possibly come after them. And she structures that exposition in a way that it's almost like a little path you have to follow down the screen from one frame to the next in order to get the next segment of narrative. And so she structures this in a way that encourages, if not requires us to scroll down and read in that fashion.
Yeah, and what I liked about that sequence in particular, too, is that I think one of the challenges of talking about a subject like this is when you get into the kind of the technical terminology of stuff and here's what actually this means. That can get really dry really quickly, right? But what she's done is by having this kind of little more, I want to say almost interactive, setup and layout to the page, the panel, however you want to describe that, because it's a little bit more involved. It requires a little bit more effort on the reader's part to kind of flow through. It doesn't feel like here's just a page of exposition, right? It's got enough interesting things going on visually, not just with the illustration, but particularly with the layout and the structure, that it doesn't come across as here's the dry medical stuff, right? I think it makes sense to include that because if you say, I think there's a lot of people who might know, okay, cystic fibrosis is bad, but I don't know what that means exactly. I think there's a lot of people in that category. So she has to explain that a little bit. And why it's not only why it's problematic, but also why it's a gene that she and her husband both have, but don't actually have the disease itself. There's a whole, that, like I said, that whole medical kind of terminology stuff can get really ugly really quickly. But she does, but because of the layout, because of the structure of how she's developed this entire piece, this entire sequence, it doesn't feel heavy. It doesn't feel overly technical, even though parts of it are.
Right. And I think one of these passages that you're referring to, and I was thinking about this earlier, it's in part 2 of Carriers. And basically, it's the scene where she and her husband go in for an amniocentesis. And so it begins in this first frame, really long frame, where she's lying on the table and her husband is holding her hand and the doctor is scanning her belly. And there is a red square drawn around her holding her husband's hand, and then there is a broken red line that extends down her arm, through her belly, and then off of her down underneath the table that she's lying on in what looks to be something like perhaps an umbilical cord, and this broken line in this loose umbilical cord, so to speak, is where we get pictures of individuals, these almost stick figure kind of ambiguously drawn people. And this is in this broken red line. And this is how we're visually told the story, right? What you were talking about, the potentially dry exposition. And in this sequence, she describes why is the cystic fibrosis mutation so common. 35% of all Caucasians are carriers. You'd think that humanity would have naturally selected it out of the gene pool, as most people with cystic fibrosis die before they can have kids. Could there have been some selective advantage for being a carrier? And then she continues on with this speculation. As we follow this image, this broken red line going down this, what I've maybe inappropriately called an umbilical cord-like thing, where these individuals are interacting, these kind of very ambiguously drawn, vague characters. But this basically tells us about not only the history, the medical history behind cystic fibrosis, but also how that applies to her and her husband's family, especially their Jewish heritage, and what that means for them today. Yeah,
and like I said, she does, I think, a very good job of explaining all that. Like, honestly, just hearing you read that sounded, I was about ready to go to sleep. No offense. There's some very dry material in there, but because the visuals are much more engaging and interesting, she's able to get that information across without putting the reader to sleep, because,
right.
Just trying to read through that, if it was just, here I'm going to do a page full of exposition, here it is. People aren't going to read that, and they're not going to retain that. And I think part of what she's trying to get to is, here's the statistic. She wants to get this information across. She wants to get the emotion across too, clearly, but that's just kind of a conduit for getting this additional information and knowledge out there. And if you're glossing over that, I think then you basically lose the point lose one of the points of the comic in the first place.
Right. Yeah, this is a great short webcomic. You definitely should check it out. Again, go to her website, laurenweinstein.com, and you can see it's in its entirety. Or you can go to Nautilus, which is nautil.us, and then search for Carriers, and you will find it. I'm glad we discussed this. I really do like the work of Lauren Weinstein, and I would like for her to do more. I wonder when her next book is going to be coming out.
I'm with you on that.
So this month we discussed 3 really engaging webcomics. We started off with Alec Longstreth's Isle of Elsi. And then after that, we looked at Late Bloomer by Zealforart. And then we wrapped up with Lauren Weinstein's Carriers.
Lots of good stuff. We always try to pick out good comics to look at, but that's one of the cool things I like about webcomics is we can keep picking out cool webcomics, and there's still more cool ones to look at after that.
Tons of them. We'll never run out of material.
I'm okay with that.
Yep. And if you want a great place to find wonderful prices on comic material, then check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, or you can visit their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. Whether you get your comics in hard copy form or in digital form, you can't go wrong with those guys. And after you check out what they have, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this month's webcomic episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or if you've got a webcomic you'd like to suggest for us to take a look at, it might be easier to drop a URL into an email rather than speak it over the phone. You can reach us by email at twoguys, TWOGUIS, at comicsalternative.com, or you can send an email directly to me at Sean, SEAN, at comicsalternative.com.
Or me at Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media, such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. So message us those ways. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to the website comicsalternative.com.
I'd recommend the latter. That's just the easiest to remember.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, if you go to our website and click on Contact Us, all the information that you'll need. Yes, so Sean and I will be back next month to talk about the 2017 Webcomics nominees. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we'll see you next month.